welcome to the darker side of the after show. This is season 3, episode number 8, The Life and Crimes of John Morrissey. This was very much like the film The Gangs of New York, and if you haven't watched that film, I'm sure you probably will now after listening to this particular episode that we've covered for this season. I'm joined, as always, on the after show by Luke here, who brings a completely different perspective as to myself and Johnston on the main show. So, Lukey, welcome, as always. The Life and Crimes of John Morrissey. Little did you know about this individual going into the episode, but what can you honestly say you've learned about John Morrissey boxing and American history all in one episode?
Uh, Kind of sums up like what most old Western movies make me think of. I'm kind of lucky I grew up in an era where people weren't as tough. Like that's kind of like my big takeaway was like before technology, like people like life was a lot harder.
Yeah, doesn't it seem just like we are very fortunate today to have what we have in life when you think of this particular story? And what we've tried to do this season, me and you, Luke, is we've always kind of brought a little bit of a theme to each after show episode, and actually not intentionally done it either. We've kind of just ended up going off on tangents about like certain things relating to the story. So if you guys are tuning in, listening, thinking we're going to start dissecting all the elements of the story, well, this might be the time to tune out. I'm telling people to tune out because we're actually going to talk about how some of these social norms that we have today were so completely different in this period of time that John Morrissey lived. It was just a completely different way of life. And even going back to like the 80s, the 70s, the 60s, the 50s, I mean, they were different ways of lives even then. But this was completely different. This story was completely different from what I've done before. And it was a very educational episode for myself personally, learning so much more about American history in this way and learning so much more about how difficult certain people's lives were at this particular time and how poverty was, how immigration was at this particular time. Immigrations are such a big issue in this era, and we didn't realise how difficult these people in this era had it. In this century, they had it 10 times harder than what anybody has it today. I mean, I'm not speaking from experience because I've not dealt with that level of experience before, but when I think of how bad the conditions were for these people travelling to the promised land of America, and I think of how it can be quite easy today to travel to another country. Not necessarily easy for them that are travelling in dinghies and boats and potentially losing their lives, but I mean in the sense that when you travel to another country today, a lot of these countries will just accept you and take you in and feed you and clothe you and house you and give you money. Whereas, like, this is a period of time where you're sleeping in really rough environments, going on transportation, which is taking you days, weeks, and sometimes even months to get to your destination. You get there and you've got nothing. You've literally got nothing. Nowhere to go, no one to see, nothing to eat, and no clothes and no hot water and any of the stuff that we have now. How hard must it have been for people in this time to have lived? I can't even fathom to think what it would have been like. I don't even think, like you said about being tough, I couldn't have lived like this. Absolutely no way. It certainly made and broke people in this era, didn't it?
Well, I was thinking about it more about us selfishly, and it could be like that I'm just being selfish, but it's like we're a couple of nerds, right? We've learned how to make podcasts, we've learned how to use algorithms, we've kind of learned how to use technology, and we have these deep pursuit of knowledge. If we're thrown in this era, we're totally like at the bottom of the totem pole because we probably don't have the toughness traits and physical attributes to get to the top. Like, look at one of the people in this story. His name is Bill the Butcher. I don't think I'd ever be called like Lukey the Lasher. Like this was just physically tough people just doing tough things to rise to the top.
It was, wasn't it? And then you think of the story of how you get into a gang and you're part of this gang and this culture. I mean, that sort of stuff hasn't changed in over 150 years. Them cultures still are here, but in different capacities and different ways. But the whole culture of gangs and violence still stands true today. And it feels very much like this is the theme of this after show, really, is like you think of gangs and cultures and ethnicities and religions and all that sort of stuff that plays into how people's social norms become. This certainly taught me something completely different, this episode, about this era in New York and San Francisco in particular, where the focus of the stories are. It certainly taught me a lot about how hard people must have been, like you've just said it right there and then. People like me and you being dropped in a time machine into this era would have absolutely not been able to survive, because we've not been built and we've not been brought up in that tough environment. Yeah, things might have been tough for us, and our definition of tough is completely different than the definition of tough in this era. And the whole theme of gangs just seemed to be the only way you were able to really make it. Then you either lived on the poverty line or you became part of a gang and lived a relatively normal life. But as a result, you were involved in violence and there was no rules really. There were police, yes. But did the police really police back then? Not really. So everybody just had the opportunity to commit crimes against one another. And in some ways it felt like when you hear the stories of people having fist fights to settle the differences, like even that's something that kind of still rings true today. Like I remember when I was younger, growing up in the early to mid 90s, like the way to settle your differences sometimes with another male was to have a fist fight, and ultimately you'd gain the respect of that person if you won that fist fight, or likewise, and that'd be the end of it and it'd be done and dusted. And it kind of felt like this was a little bit like that in this story, but it escalated to a new level where people just took the law, or what little law there was, into their own hands and were just able to go and commit these crimes and practically get away with a lot of them as well, and like serve really minimal jail sentences and times and just crack on with life. And ultimately, anyone that sort of rode down this road would either end up dead early on in their lives and not really live a long life, which life expectancy wasn't that great anyway in this time. You would either live like that or you'd just live in poverty and die of some sort of disease anyway. So it just feels like you had really no escape from whatever was presented to you in this time. It feels different. It really does feel different. And the one thing that still remains the same to me is the gang culture.
But I mean, just look at like the career arc of this guy, from like gangs and all types of stuff, having issues with people and then ending in a political arena. Like what would be the modern equivalent of like a boxer who's somewhat gang affiliated who then becomes trying to run for political office? It's just such a different world now. If you were affiliated with gangs in boxing, I feel like you would not have a platform to run on for political, like in a political landscape. I think everything that you would do would be weaponized on the internet and through media, and you wouldn't have a platform to really represent people. That alone just tells you how different the world was.
It does, doesn't it? And then the only person I can really think of that springs to mind about political side of things is, of course, Manny Pacquiao. But Manny Pacquiao came from a really impoverished background, made it to the top of his sport that he was able to get into and chose, essentially, and is able to do good things in his own country and make the world, in his eyes, a better place because of the position of power that he now has. But it's a different comparison, really. You feel like you think of boxing and you think of politicians, you think of probably Pacquiao in this generation, but John Morrissey and Manny Pacquiao are just two completely different people. John Morrissey came over as an illegal immigrant and essentially built himself a reputation by bullying people, fighting people, and intimidating people. And Manny Pacquiao wasn't that guy. So when I say comparisons, it's very minimal comparisons. Just the fact that these are both recorded boxers that ended up going on to be politicians. But because of the landscape of that time period John Morrissey was from, he was able to maneuver himself into a position of power because of his influences, because of his reputation. And reputation then seemed to mean a hell of a lot more and give you a hell of a lot more power than certainly what it does today. It just seems really strange, like to have a story of a guy who committed these crimes and just really didn't give a shit about what he did, but was able to then go to the state senate within politics in America. I think it's a huge underrated story, and that film Gangs of New York is loosely based on a few characters from John Morris's story. I know Bill the Butcher is certainly one of the characters that is based upon in that movie, and I know sort of John Morrissey kind of in some way does kind of feature in that movie. So if you haven't seen it and you've listened to the full episode and you're now listening to this, it's so wise to go and watch it, because that's the first thing Johnston said to me before we did this episode. He said, Sean, go and watch the Gangs of New York. And I thought, you know what, I've never seen it, even though it's been out over 20 years. I've never seen that film. I watched it in preparation for the episode, and my God, I was like, when covering it and going through the episode, I could visualize from the film moments from it of how these things actually went down, and that's kind of what we love to do is paint this picture in your mind as a listener, like what this was really like. But this whole
I mean,
gang, go.
oh, my bad. I got bad cell. I was gonna say that just simply like if some boxer is gonna become a politician now, they got to be like Jesse Vargas or Manny Pacquiao, where there's like an air of fakeness to them, where you're like, okay, they're presentable. For all intents and purposes, this guy's a bully, like you said. He's a jerk. He's someone that pushed people around, and he was someone that found his way by bullying people into a position of power.
What do you think made him revered to in American political history? Why do you think people look back in history? I'm not saying everybody does, but I'm saying some. From what I read about John Morrissey doing this episode, and what I read into different articles and different posts from websites in America, was that some of them sort of looked at him as a bit of a hero in some way, a bit of a hero story. But one of the things I said in the episode itself, and Johnston agreed with me on that, was that you can't really glorify this man in that way. Like, the guy, like you say, and we both agreed on this episode, he was a bully, he was an intimidator, he was an instigator. He did what he wanted to do, and he got away with a lot of it. So why can you glorify someone like this? Why do you think people within America, like, they write stuff like this? What is it that's so good about him as an individual that makes him worth writing about, in the sense of he did so much in the political world, but he didn't do it in a normal way. He did it in a corrupt way, like ballot box stuffing and things of that nature. Like, this was this generation. This guy would be hung, drawn, and quartered, but he was allowed to do it in that generation. But yet people look back on him and go, yeah, he was one of the first big boxers of the time, and he was a politician, and he's an absolute hero. And ultimately, that's kind of why we wanted to cover this episode, was all them elements of it. But really, he was just someone who committed crimes and did heinous things that was able to manipulate people into putting him into a position of power. That's all I saw from this.
I think we often romanticize people who live these lives that we want to like in some way. So that I'm gonna ramble, but that's okay. I guess that's what this show's for. But I think there's a level of like everyone has insecurity about the way they grew up, and everyone wants to have a good life, but be able to take ownership of having a hard life. Like somehow, if you talk to everybody, everybody grew up in the hood. And if you look at the statistics, that's just impossible. Not everybody grew up in the level in poverty in the hood or around tough circumstances. And I think that there is in America this level of cult following where people really, really appreciate someone that comes from the bottom and rises up in power. And I think oftentimes, because that's so hard to do in America, if you're able to do that by any means necessary, we will romanticize it. And I think that's where a lot of his revered nature comes from.
But I think that appeal crosses over to different countries. Like, I think the UK takes a lot from America, in the sense that the cultures of gangs has certainly come from America to the UK. And you get people in this day and age now that look at that gang culture in America and want to replicate what happens over there over here, and it happens. I mean, London in the UK is got some really, really, really difficult places to live, and if you want to call anywhere a hood, there are many places within London, which is a big place for the UK. There's many places there where people come from poverty, and there's only two choices. You either get into a gang and become part of a gang, or you make your own path and you actually get yourself out of that area and move on and do something good with your life. But a lot of the times people get drawn into the attraction and the thrill of being a part of a gang that does certain things in certain ways, and it feels like that gang culture, going back to this period of time where John Morrissey was in, is it's never really changed, because the attraction of being a part of something like that seems to still be a part of society and be a part of the social norm in some respects. And it feels, because of how things have moved on with the world and the technology's moved on and it's facilitated certain things to happen in life, that culture then has never really changed. The premise of the gang culture has never changed. It's just been facilitated in different ways and become more advanced and just sort of become a different version of what this once was all those years ago. But it still remains. It really still remains, and it's still rife within many different parts of the world. Not just the UK and the US. There's many different parts of this world that it happens in. South America, a lot of the countries in South America have so many different gangs. You can't even go into certain areas, and you are literally putting your life in the line. And you can go to many countries in Asia and feel the same. But unless you know about how this works, unless you know about these cultures and become a bit more educated within it, you could be walking into a really, really horrible situation for yourself. And I just think that gang culture is huge, but it's not good. And I don't understand why people would want to live that way of life. And I mean, that's coming from somebody who's never really been in that situation, but I've certainly been around unsavoury characters in my life as a youngster, and been around certain people that have gone on to commit certain crimes in their lives. But I never saw the attraction of and the thrill of wanting to inflict something either upon someone or something, to be able to be a part of this group of people that were able to go around terrorising people. I never saw the attraction to any of it personally, and it was something as soon as my friends became involved in it, it was certainly a moment in my life where I had to step away and just go, do you know what? This isn't me. This isn't my life. This isn't who I want to be. And I suppose it must be really difficult for anybody of a certain age getting involved with certain people in society. In America, Luca, does this happen more often than not?
I mean, I think that the issue is in America, like if you look at like a lot of what's popular for like young people, there's different lanes, right? So you got like the Ryan Garcia, I want to be like a cute model person. And then like for an aggressive male or female, there's this whole subgenre of here's art and entertainment built around gang culture. You look at platforms like No Jumper, Vlad TV, like they willingly or unwillingly or unknowingly promote kind of gang issues that romanticize it to a young person. And I think that this issue with gangs is getting worse with YouTube, because you can go down a rabbit hole. Say, like, you look up a gangster, a modern gangster, you can go on a binge and learn more about these gang members from whatever area you're from than you can American or British politicians or legislation in your country. And I think it's very dangerous. Knowledge is power, but the wrong type of knowledge, I think, encourages bad behavior.
That's a really good way of explaining it. The wrong type of knowledge encourages bad behaviour. It certainly rings true in my mind, and I think many of you guys listening, when we talk about this whole gang culture, maybe one of you guys at some point has been a part of gang culture, been roped into it in some way, shape or form, or maybe has been in it and come out of it. And it's a really serious issue. Like, this after show does kind of become quite deep at times, because we're talking about real issues here that relate to certain stories. And this is a real issue. This is something that, isn't really too dissimilar from what John Morrissey and his compatriots were going through all those years ago. Yet the difference is now we seem to have a more organised country, and we seem to have more organised states, and we seem to have law enforcements, but yet you can't even always trust the law enforcement to do their job correctly at times. Many incidents of really bad things that have gone on with law enforcement, which is why not a lot of people trust law enforcement. And a lot of people feel that there is racism absolutely rife within law enforcement, and there's some really relevant situations that have gone on in the past 25 years that have involved an African American male and police officers. And I don't need to spell it out to people. It's pretty evident. You'll certainly know which ones I'm referring to. It's happened in the UK. It happens here as well. Like it's absolutely crazy. Like the gang culture leads to more law enforcement on the street. That law enforcement then becomes too heavy-handed and then creates further antagonization within these gangs. So these people within these gangs feel the need to then expand their networks even further out, because ultimately they're not scared of any consequences, because they're not scared of law enforcement, because law enforcement in particular in the UK doesn't have the same powers as what law enforcement has in the US to exercise certain things. And you just see so many stories of incidents where you get law enforcement trying to apprehend a suspect, and either they go too heavy-handed, or the suspect ends up killing a member of law enforcement. And it all stems from stuff like this, from this sort of culture of violence, this expression that people want to have within a certain remit of being able to say, look, this is me, this is who I am, and this is what I do, but not realising that there are consequences to actions. And this is why it's been so heavily focused on gang culture and violence, because the story of John Morrissey and his compatriots and his foes, it was all violence, gang violence, corruption, the sort of stuff that really just hasn't changed. It really hasn't.
Let me illustrate another point that'll be boring to people. So when I was growing up, my mom was the principal. I never got to leave school until 5 or 6 p.m. in the evening. So if you're going to punish me and keep me after school from 2:30 to 4, there's really no punishment because I have to be there regardless. I feel like a lot of the issues with gangs are most people in gangs, I'd say 40-50%, are born into gangs, and they don't break the cycle of their family being involved in gangs. So really the consequences are stuff they're born into and they accept through the circumstance and depression. And it's unhelpful when people from outside of these things kind of jump into that, because when they jump into those situations, it's typically through these romanticized platforms, and then it gets tricky.
Well, the story of John Morrissey is pretty much one of crimes, violence, politicians, gangsters. There's many words you can throw around about this whole story and the characters that are within it. And I think what just rings very true is that some things change dramatically over time, but some things stay the same. And the whole gang culture, gang violence has certainly stayed the same. It's just facilitated in a different way now. Different means, different methods. You mentioned YouTube channels that practically promote it. I mean, this is a crazy world that we live in, that people are actively out there fantasizing, romanticizing, and promoting this type of a life to live. And you begs the question, sometimes you think to yourself, why would you want to bring another life into this world? Because of the world that we currently live in. I have children. I think to myself, what is this world going to be like for their children if they go on to have children? It's it's kind of really scary to think about, the way things are progressing and how society is progressing. You think of this story with John Morrison, you kind of think in a way look, these were guys that, although they were a bit lawless in a lawless time, they did have sort of morals, and they did have a code, so to speak. Regardless of what you think of that code, there was a moral code there between them. Whereas now there just doesn't seem to be any sort of code. People commit random acts of violence. Some people go around and commit these horrible acts of violence as an initiation process. So someone's life could be taken for somebody else to become a part of a gang. It is crazy how the world has developed over all of these years. And this story, all it kind of told me was that, if anything, even though this was a really difficult time to live in because of the way the world was then, the world's got worse. It might have got better in many, many ways, but it certainly got worse in others. And I think violence, the culture of gangs, has certainly got a hell of a lot worse than what it was then. I don't know if you agree, Lukey, but it feels that way. It feels that way to me, having now known this story and its history.
See, I grapple with that, and I think that everything is the exact same. I think just the ability to see everything in real time makes us feel like things are worse. And people getting monetization or views or likes based off of stupidity maybe ups the ante a bit. But I truly believe that if we go back 10, 50, 100 years ago, things are just as bad. It's just we didn't know about things occurring, if you get what I'm saying. Like we didn't see it in real time.
Yeah, I get.
Nowadays, see things in real time to the point where we go, oh my God, this is happening again. This is happening again. Oh, this person's issuing a like. Imagine if we were boxing reporters 20 years ago, it would be really important to go to fights because if you don't go to the fight, you don't get a quote. Now, within 3 hours of the fight, I get an email with quotes. That this morning I got an email while I'm driving about Jarrett Hurd. You get all this content given to you. It's almost too overwhelming. It's like I almost don't need to go out and get interviews because there's too much coming into me. And I think that's more the issue.
So, in some respects, what you're saying is like ignorance maybe was bliss in certain periods of time because you didn't see what was going on all the time. You wasn't able to be scaremongered by it. You wasn't able to see this sort of stuff playing out, in real time, like you say. So as a result of not seeing it play out in real time, it doesn't feel as prevalent maybe in these periods of time before we were born as opposed to what it is now. And yeah, I've heard that before. I've heard like people talking about like because of the birth of the internet and social media, like we get to see all this stuff that we wouldn't necessarily have ever really saw before. And the odd thing you might have picked up on the local news channel, but like the stuff that you get to see, I mean, let me give another good example of what I'm referring to. There is a few pages on Twitter that specifically post out videos of classroom fights, street fights, just basically fights anywhere. And these have just been recorded on somebody's phone and they get posted onto, say, Twitter, for example, and then they get thousands and thousands of retweets and likes and quotes and comments, and people go, oh wow, what a knockout. And in reality, this is a really horrible situation that someone's been a part of. Whoever the perpetrators or instigators are, someone ends up hurt at the end of it all, and yet this is just, for some people, just entertainment. So I suppose it comes back down to you as an individual and what your moral compass tells you about these types of things. Are you the type of person that will just sit and go, wow, yeah, what a knockout that was, retweet it, reshare it, whatever? Or are you the sort of person that will go, you know what, I'm not going to give this the time of day because the type of people that are putting this out there, I mean, what type of people are they to get value and entertainment out of it? It does make you question humanity in general. Things like that, for me, do make me question humanity and what the purpose of parts of humanity are in this world and this life, because people glorify that sort of stuff, whereas what you're saying, or what I'm kind of interpreting you're saying, is like previously people were kind of ignorant to it because they didn't have to see it in the faces 24/7.
And I'll give you another great example, and this show should be called I'll Give You Another Good Example because that's what I keep saying is I'm not really on my cell phone all that much. I use it to talk, but I don't use things. And when I stay with other people, I see how much they're on their cell phones. And it's like, oh, that's why people care about these things. Because like I don't really like I don't put value on Instagram. I don't put value on Twitter. I just post certain things and then I leave. One of the most powerful art things that I had seen recently, I wish I knew the artist's name was, It's like an Instagram. It was like a portrait of someone in an Instagram box, and it basically showed no followers and no likes of the picture, and the person was frowning. And that's basically the society we've created, where it's like the new currency is the amount of followers and the amount of love you can get on the internet, as opposed to creating financial gain for yourself or finding spiritual fulfillment.
But it's like people need the approval of other people online that they've never met in their lives before. That's kind of what I take away from what it's become now. Like when it first really came to prominence in the mid 2000s, I was around about 16, 17, 18, around when it first came out. So, yes, it was all very new. And admittedly, I became sucked into the world of it at that point. But as I've got older, I look at it from an outside perspective and look at it and go, do you know what? There isn't really any value this is adding to my day to day life by being a part of it or telling people what I did last night or telling people what I had for tea. Don't get me wrong, I use this facility to be able to promote what we do, and it wouldn't have allowed me to be able to meet people like yourself, Lukey, and many other great people that I've met through boxing and through being a part of social media. So, yes, benefits of it, when they work well, they work really, really well. But then for the most part, it is just oversaturated with different people looking for different approvals about different things in life. And it is sad what it's kind of created. Whereas this story of John Morrissey is just living in a world way before any of this was available. And people would actually have to have conversations with people to be able to settle differences or to be able to actually gain relationships and friendships with people. And it's another overarching theme of this after show is like gang culture and violence, but also the way society has become. And you look at maybe some different periods of time were just much more simple. I mean, you speak to people in your life, Luke. I'm sure you've spoke to people from different generations, much older people in your own family. I know I have, and they tell me what life was like when none of this stuff was around and before the birth of any type of technology. And it's like it seemed a much simpler time, but yet then where would we be without this sort of stuff now? Like the benefits of what we do have does create really good things for people. So it really feels like something that you have to grapple with about social morality.
Yeah, I mean, it's just one of these things where I feel like the people that have learned how to use social media have two versions of themselves. It's like, here's the person I exist in reality, and then there's like this character I've created that only lives in the internet. It's like people's desired personality, or is this thing that people want to live vicariously through. And that's kind of like the way I see that, like social media going is creating like alternative personas of like fantasy worlds.
I feel much like this is what it's turning into. Is like an online multiplayer community, like the World of Warcraft or something of that nature. It's kind of like people are creating those personas, but actually bringing them into their real lives and creating separate personas of themselves. It's a scary, scary world, and it has dramatically changed from John Morrissey's era and the story of John Morrissey and his crimes and his moments in time that we've covered for the main episode. And this after show, we love to use it to bring these different overarching themes, and I hope that there are some real relatable conversations going on. And of course, if you don't feel there are any relatable conversations going on with these after shows, then obviously let us know at darker_side_pod on Twitter and on Facebook and on Instagram. You know, all the socials that we've just been sat there talking about and having our comments on. All them socials. It's a good way really to hear from people who I know tune into the show and can relate to some conversation that we've had at some point during the show. And it also goes back to the actual story that we've covered, which is the story of John Morrissey and how much things have changed, but some things are still the same. And I'd love to hear from people about these types of conversations and what people do think on it, because I know there's a lot of genuine people that think and sort of feel the same as what we do. So when we hear from them, it's great. But when we also hear from people that have a different perspective on it, it really does help gauge where people's moral compass and social morality is actually at. So please do make sure you let us know like what you think about these conversations and these topics and how it relates to the story and how things have changed. All that sort of stuff is really great when we get that sort of message through from people. So please make sure you do drop us a message and drop us a share on social media and let people hear these conversations, let more of them hear it, because it is really good to reach out and have these types of conversations and sort of figure out where other people are at and what they feel about things. A lot of the time I find it's people of a similar age to me that have a same feeling as sort of what we talk about on these shows, Lukey. So if anybody's got anything different to bring to the table, then please do. Now, if you haven't already followed Lukey on social media, you can do it at Lukey Boxing. On Twitter, you can find him on there and you can see all of his posts about ITR boxing and the boxing shows and the filming that he does and every little bit of great content that he actually does for the benefit of this sport of boxing. And if you want to follow any of our other shows, you can find the Legendary Nights podcast or the Career Profiles podcast or the main podcast feed at BTR Boxing Podcast Network. And if you haven't already subscribed to get all of the latest episodes of The Darker Side of Boxing, please make sure you do find us on any available podcasting app out there. That is it for this show. Next week, we have episode number 9, and we have the real life Rocky Balboa. That's right, we're going to be covering Chuck Wepner in episode number 9, and he is another character who certainly has a hell of a story. Well, for this episode, thank you for listening. We hope you've enjoyed it, and we will see you next week.